Howdy, everybody. Welcome to another Accessibility Talks or Alley Talks, the monthly virtual meetup where we chat and talk about digital accessibility, inclusivity, and usability. Each month, we invite a speaker to present a topic, and afterward, we invite the community to ask questions and participate in the discussion. I'm your host today. My name is Matt Goodwin. I work at Red Hat as a software engineering manager, and I use the pronouns he, him. All right, but before we get in too far into this talk, I do want to let you know that we will have live transcripts available at bit.ly/A11yTalks live transcripts. That's A11yTalks live transcript. You can also look for the link in the chat. You can also enable the YouTube closed captioning if that works better for you. All right, let's take a quick moment here to remind everybody that our group seeks to provide a friendly, safe environment. We require all participants to adhere to the Accessibility Talks Code of Conduct. This includes the speakers, hosts, and those watching on YouTube, and folks commenting on social networks. This applies to all community interactions and events, verbal questions, and any text chat in the text channels. Thank you. This code of conduct can also be found on the website. If you go to https://a11ytalks.com/conduct. All participants should be able to engage in productive dialogue and should share and learn with each other in an atmosphere that's of mutual respect. All right, got questions? We love questions. At the end of the presentation, we'll take some time for Q&A. If you have a question for our speakers during the talk, there's a couple ways that you can ask. During the live talk, type your question into the YouTube chat window. It can be a bit busy in there, so please start any questions with the letter Q or the word question, so it's easier for us to find that during the live event. Also, add the hashtag pound A11Talks, that's A11yTalks to Mastodon and Twitter. All right, and don't want to forget, huge shout out to our friends over at Agile Collective for becoming a bronze sponsor of Alley Talks. We truly appreciate your support. Oh, and also, don't want to forget, big shout out to our Alley Cat Club members who donate monthly to our Alley Talks and to our one-time donors as well. Thank you so much for your financial contributions. All right, want to see your organization recognized as a sponsor of Alley Talks and help fund these amazing monthly meetups, or maybe you want to see your name here. Visit our sponsorship page at A11yTalks.com/sponsorship to learn more. All right, very good. Well, friends, today we've got Nikki Massaro, Senior Design Engineer at Adobe. I do have a fun fact about her. During the pandemic, she did something that was interesting. So I'm going to turn it over to you to reveal that, Nikki.
Sure. So yeah, during the pandemic, when everybody was playing with the Zoom backgrounds, I would find different backgrounds and I would cosplay with them and show up at meetings in costume. And it was a lot of fun. I actually did that for over a year, 2 to 3 meetings a week, different costumes, and just to cheer everybody on my team up for a lot of fun. Ended up posting them on social media so that friends who I didn't work with directly could still enjoy them. It was a lot of fun.
That is a lot of fun. I'm so glad you do things like that. I try to do stuff like that too. occasionally. But today I do want to share that you're going to present to us using controllers for keyboard accessibility, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you, Matt. So yeah, my name is Nikki Massaro and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a woman in my late 40s with dark hair, green eyes, and fair skin. While I'm currently working for Adobe, I'm actually wearing a Red Hat Global Accessibility Awareness Day t-shirt. I don't think we can catch all of it, but it's there. Trust me. So a little bit more about myself. If I am an IAAP certified web accessibility specialist. Like we said, I am a senior design engineer for Adobe. That's actually very, very recent, late April, early May, actually. And before that, I was a former principal UX engineer at Red Hat with Matt. Um, so a lot of my examples that I'll be talking about are actually from my experience at Red Hat working on Red Hat design systems and web components. And prior to coming to Red Hat, I was involved in higher ed. I'm a former president of the High Ed Web Association. The High Ed Web Association has some great content for professionals in higher education that have digital jobs. They do every summer an online accessibility one-day summit. And next week, I'll be traveling to Albuquerque for their in-person annual conference where I'm presenting and actually still involved in and chairing the conference. I got involved with High Ed Web because prior to Adobe or Red Hat, I spent 19 years as a programmer analyst at Penn State University. All of that time, I've been working on web components and design systems. Some of the Penn State time was pre-web components and design systems, but the bulk of my work has been in making design systems and authoring tools for people. So moving on from there. I would also like to describe the image on the slide. My apologies. It is a picture of myself, and I'm in a sequined blazer, a black sequined blazer. And to demonstrate that I've worn a lot of hats in my career, I actually have hats stacked on my head to where you can't see my eyes. There's a straw sun hat with a wide brim at the bottom layer, and then on top of that is a black top hat, and above that was my red hat, red fedora. So now, moving on and getting to what I want to talk about. If I asked you to draw a house or to describe one, what would you make? And if you want to participate in the chat and just explain, how you would go about drawing a house, I'd be very happy to learn. I'll give you a minute. Nobody wants to tackle how to draw a house? Ooh, April says a square with a triangle on top. So I actually used this exercise with some friends and family, and I asked them to draw a house. The image I have on my slide are actually two images, two different family drawings of a house. The one on the left is on unlined paper. It's done in black pen. It's a two-story house with 5 windows on the front. It's three-dimensional to some extent. And on the front of the house, the 5 windows have shutters. There's also a yard and a pathway to the door with a tree and a tire swing. And on the right is a house on college ruled line paper in red pen. And it's a two-dimensional house. And uh, it is basically a square with a triangle on top. It's got 2 windows on the second story, no windows on the first story, and it's got a chimney with some smoke coming out. So, as you can imagine, asking family members to draw houses, the results varied. I have more images on this slide. One of them is unlined paper again, and it's a two-dimensional house with a little bit of perspective drawn in. It's 2 stories, but has also an attic and a double chimney, 2 trees out in the front yard. The windows have 4 panes. And then there's one in the upper right that's also on online paper, this time in various marker colors and a combination of 4-pane windows and 2-pane windows. And then in the bottom right is this really, really good detailed drawing in colored pencil by my nephew. It is definitely a 3D isometric drawing of a yellow Cape Cod, and it's got 4-pane windows and shutters on the side and a red door, a sidewalk, and a little addition off to the right of it. So, it's a very detailed house. Of course, not all of the houses that I got from friends and family were structurally sound. I have an image that is a very, very crooked house drawing that is a mixture of pen and pencil. It's hard to see in the image, but it looks like they started drawing it on pencil first, messed up, erased, and then went over some of the pencil that they wanted to keep in red marker. The doorknob is partially off of the door, and the windows are a bit off center and crooked. There's even some landscaping with red pen, but basically not all of these house drawings would be structurally sound. And my joke here is that it's a good thing there aren't building codes on house drawings, or we'd be in trouble. Now, what if I had given everyone the same set of rules to follow, along with a shared set of components? And this gets back to April's square with a triangle on top. I have an image of a yellow rectangle, a brown triangle, roof shaped, a red rectangular door shape with a gold knob in the middle, and two 4-paned windows that are basically just rectangles with smaller rectangles in them, and the trim is like a dark red. Would that experience, if we gave them these standard components and a set of rules to follow, be more consistent, accessible, and structurally sound? The image that I have on this slide are 3 houses constructed with those components, and they are pretty much the same shape. They all seem pretty stable, and the big variation is in color. The first one uses all the original colors that I mentioned. The second one basically changed the door and roof color to match the dark red of the trim and made the rectangle house color blue. And then the final one is a gray house with a dark blue door that matches dark blue trim and a black roof. A lot of this kind of reminds me of the work that I do in design systems. And so, we're basically giving people a shared set of components in design systems to ensure that what we build is consistent. We might be able to give them color options and things, but the options are limited, and it ensures that what we're building is consistent into a set of standards. Additionally, as far as guidelines, we have, like the building codes in our house example, we're given a set of standards to ensure that what we build is accessible. I forgot to mention that the image on my previous slide was a screenshot from the Red Hat design system, the design system I worked on, one of the 2 design systems I worked on when I was at Red Hat. The screenshot I have on this slide is a screenshot of the WCAG 2 overview page. So our building codes for making sure that things that we build are accessible. So let's take what we build to the next level. And I need to warn you, if you haven't figured it out already, I like to go really hard on themes. So I went on to the house building. And so the image that I have on this slide is a level, which also means that I'm big for bad puns. So taking it to the next level, and this is actually a building tool level that I made to match this slide. So how do we ensure, in taking these things to the next level, how do we ensure that the components themselves are consistent and accessible? And on my screenshot, I have the Red Hat design system tabs component, which is a web component. All of my work in design systems have been web components based because I'm a developer. And while I'm, whether I was at Penn State, Red Hat, or Adobe, I've always made components for design systems. And this is the tabs component and the documentation from our design system on tabs, particularly the accessibility and keyboard navigation of tabs for this tabs component. So how do we ensure that these components we have, if we're using the design system to make sure that everybody's consistent in what they build, we need to make sure that the design system itself is consistent and accessible because there are multiple developers who are working on the design system itself. Well, one of the things that I've done over my time as a developer of web components is that when I begin to work on a component for my team, the first thing I do is I refer to a pattern from the WAI ARIA Authoring Practices Guide, or the APG. And I'm sure many of you refer to the Authoring Practices Guide to figure out how to build accessible things. So the screenshot that I have is actually the tabs pattern from the APG. And since I had the tabs component, so what if I were working on the tabs component for whichever design system I was working on, this is the first place I'd look. Whether I'm starting something net new or I'm doing a code review on contributors who contributed to the tabs, or we're adding a feature, I look here first. And so that's me, and that's how I make sure that my work is accessible. But I work with tons of other developers, and I work in open source, so I have contributors. And so while the design system is meant to to allow the people who build with the components to help them be more consistent and accessible, what can I do to help make my other developers work in a consistent, accessible way to make the design system itself consistent and accessible? Well, native web components can use these reactive controllers. And reactive controllers are basically, if you consider them almost like a design system for common states and behaviors of web components. I'm going to give you a specific one that I created for accessibility, but first, the screenshot that I have here is simply the tabs component documentation, a screenshot of it, and the different dark and light themes to talk about the light and dark states of the Red Hat design system tabs and how that's a controller that someone else wrote for our design system, but all of the components that have a light and dark theme are sharing that state through a reactive controller. So moving on, we make these reactive controllers also for accessibility patterns, or, when I started working for Red Hat, I wanted to make reactive controllers for accessibility patterns. We were making it for dark and light. I thought there are lots of really great accessibility uses because I was just one person, and I wanted to make sure that my team was also doing accessible things. So, for example, in most cases, keyboard users navigate interactive elements using the tab key. And my little pun here is that I have a screenshot of the tab soda from the 80s. And of course, I don't mean that kind of tab. I mean the tab key on a keyboard. So if you can imagine a page that has a table of contents, like jump links that link to different content on the page, and then maybe it's followed by a set of tabs, and then finally an accordion. Those are three different components, but those three different components could have a lot of different items within them. If all of the elements within those components were tab key navigation, that would be a lot of navigation. On sites with all of those navigation elements and complex controls, tab would be too much. So just with those three different controls, if I was navigating to that accordion, there would be 8 steps. I would be tabbing to the first jump link, tabbing to the second jump link, tabbing to the third jump link, tabbing to the first tab list item, tabbing to the second tab list item, tabbing to the third, tabbing to the accordion panel, and then tabbing to the second accordion panel. And that's a small amount of interactive elements. You can imagine a page full of, main nav and toolbars, lots of accordions, lots of tabs all over the page. And that could be a lot of repetitive work to navigate to something specifically. So instead, each complex component is supposed to use arrow keys to navigate within. And the way that would work is I'm a user, I'm on the page. The first time I hit tab, I go to the jump links. But I don't want to stay in the jump links. So I can just hit tab to skip over the jump links and into the tab list. And the next thing I do is I tab to the accordion. I do want to be in the accordion, so I hit the arrow down key to navigate to the second panel of the accordion. This standard practice for navigation is implemented using what's called a roving tab index method. You can find that in the keyboard navigation section of the APG. And a roving tab index works like this. Basically, you have a series of items in a complex component. Only one item is active within that component. It's going to have the 0 tab index, and that allows tab or shift tab to navigate to focus within the component on its active item. Inactive items, all the other items that are not active, are going to have a negative tab index, so the tab key will skip over them and on to the next or the previous component, depending upon whether they hit tab or shift tab. In the right-hand section of this slide, I have some sample code. It's basically 4 divs. Each of those divs has a role of tab. Now, you'll notice that they also have tab index. The second div also has aria selected equals true. That's the only one with a tab index 0 is the currently selected. The other tabs have a tab index of -1 because they're the inactive tabs. So if somebody were to tab into that particular set of tabs, they would immediately go to the second tab. And if they hit tab again, they would leave the tabs. They wouldn't go to the next tab. They would need the arrow keys to navigate. So what happens when we use the arrow key? When an arrow key is pressed down, the active item changes. And so the tab index of each item is updated accordingly, and the focus is set on the active item. So I actually changed the code on this slide. We still have the 3 divs with role equals tab, but that second one no longer has aria selected, and the tab index is now a -1. However, the third tab, because we're imagining that I hit an arrow down key, the third tab now has aria selected and tab index 0. So if a keyboard user navigates away from the component, the active item is maintained. When a user navigates back to the component, focus returns to that active item. A roving tab index using that key down event listener rather than key up is going to allow the user to press and hold the arrow key quickly rather than lifting and pressing the key. So we tend to do ours on a key down. That way somebody could just easily skip through several options. I have an animation warning on here. I'm not sure if the animation is going to play or not, but if animation bothers you, I'll just describe it's basically simulating an arrow key going through these divs, an arrow down key, and what happens to the tab index. And the animation did not work. So you no longer have to avert your eyes. So the WIA ARIA authoring practice guide recommends arrow key navigation for the following patterns: accordions, grids, list boxes, menus, radio groups, tabs, toolbar, tree grid, tree view. And there are many other patterns that you might have that aren't specifically listed here that are very complex components that probably should also use the roving tab index arrow key navigation pattern. So those are a lot of components. This is kind of like the drawing a house problem. We have all of these different components that people are making, and there's a lot of variation, but they have one big thing in common. And we should probably have them behave all in the same way. And this is where the idea of a controller comes into play. So to ensure that this keyboard pattern is implemented consistently, Red Hat's complex components use a roving tab index controller. And I have a screenshot here of the roving tab index controller on GitHub. So my slide deck link will actually have the link to the roving tab index controller on GitHub. So the way the roving tab index controller works in the GitHub repository is, again, only one item is active within the component. And that active item is the only one that gets the 0 tab index. So the tab or shift tab is going to set focus within the component and onto its active item. Then the inactive items are going to have the negative tab index, and that's going to allow tab or shift tab to skip over them and onto the next or the previous component. The code that I have to the right of that is basically a function set at focused item index, and then it takes in an index, which is a number, and we're going to get the item from a group of items within the component that is at that focused item index, and that's the active item. Then we have a for loop, and it's basically going through each of the items in the tab list. And if the item is the same as the active item, it's going to set the tab index to 0. And if not, it's setting all of the other items tab index to -1. And that's how we are ensuring that there is only one tab index 0, and that's the active item, and all the others are negative. Now, the next part of the code is for when the arrow key is pressed down, the active item is going to change. The tab index of each item is updated accordingly, and focus is set on the active item. So I don't have the keyboard listening section of this code, but you can see that if the item is in focus, or if the item is in focus and we're updating the active item, we need to focus on the active item. And it says item focus if the item exists. So then we've created this controller. This controller exists. Any of the components, the accordions, the tabs, the grids, the toolbars, whatever complex component we need to use it, all it has to do as a web component is to import the controller into it and add a few lines of code. And then they don't have to recreate the code for listening to the keyboard and setting active items. We're going to import. And the code just says import and in curly brackets, roving tab index controller, and that's from, and in single quotations, the path is at Patternfly, which is Patternfly Elements, the other design system I worked on for Red Hat. And then it's pfe-core/controller/roving-tab index-controller.js and a semicolon. So that's the import statement that pulls in this controller into any of the components so that we don't have to maintain all that separate code. And then the component uses the tab index controller by specifying which items are going to be part of the roving tab index. And so the example code I have highlighted is tab index equals roving tab index controller dot of this. It's saying, hey, let's make a tab index is going to be a new roving tab index controller. This is the component that has the roving tab index controller, and my list of items is a function called get items, and it's going to grab the headers, and above it there's code specifying where the headers are and how we're looking for the accordion children headers. So it's passing a selection of headers from within the accordion component to the roving tab index controller, and that's all it's got to do. An accordion only has to have that import line from the previous slide, and then it only has to define what a tab index controller is, or define what the tab index controller is, who's the parent component, and how do you find the items within that controller that it's going to manage. And so it's managed in one place, only one time do we have to worry about it, and all the other components we're ensuring are built to code. So Red Hat Design System and Patternfly Elements currently has many, many controllers, all because we're trying to manage some of these things centrally instead of having duplicate code and chances for error and things not being structurally sound. So we have roving tab index, the example that I showed you that implements the roving tab index arrow key navigation. We also have element internals, and that's setting properties internal, such as the ARIA states and properties. There is a heading level component that is for a complex component that has headings within it. It automatically adjusts the headings within the component based on where it sits in the heading hierarchy. There's also a component for list boxes to make sure that we have the correct property, states, and behavior on any component that has a list box. We have an internationalization controller to apply translations to the component microcopy and so many other controllers. Controllers are very, very useful in many things beyond accessibility, but there are so many accessibility applications to use when you think about using a reactive controller. If you'd like to learn more, I have links for the WIA ARIA Authoring Practices Guide, or APG, a link to the RHDS, Red Hat Design System Accessibility Contributors page, where we talk about accessibility controllers, and the link to a code example using the roving tab index controller. Oops. I jumped out of my slides. I did not mean to do that. There we go. And oh, those are my last slides. So if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nikki. All right, yeah, I guess we're open for questions and answers. All right, it seems there's no questions at the moment. I know that there's a little bit of a delay here as well, so give another moment.
Time travel.
Yeah.
I'm from the future.
All right, I think some questions are coming in, so. I thought I saw someone typing a question, so. Oh, wait, here we go.
Oh.
I see one here. Yes. Do you have a functional example of the rotor use? Thank you.
I do not. I have a functional example of just the keyboard navigation. I can share that. In one moment, I'm going to connect to the YouTube chat. Okay, so I mentioned that these controllers live in Patternfly elements, and that I also work with Red Hat Design System. So what we have here is I'm posting a link to Patternfly Elements tabs. And I believe that Select also uses them. It's been a while since I've worked on these, so they may have changed. But I believe these two examples from Patternfly Elements actually use the controller. And on my slide, I can give you the code example of it in action. Oh, the accordion also does it. So this is the core of the accordion actually using that controller.
Are we seeing your screen or the slide still? Because I think
I put it in the comments of the chat.
Gotcha. Excellent. All right. I believe there was another question here. When are you using the keyboard and how to navigate using the rotor?
When am I using the keyboard? I'm not quite sure I understand. The connection between keyboard and screen reader accessibility. Well, the keyboard is more about, making sure something is keyboard navigable. And so if somebody, is not using a mouse, and a mouse requires vision. So if we're using keyboard navigation, we're making it accessible to somebody who can't use a mouse. And normally they would use a tab key, but what we're doing is using arrow keys instead.
Looks like we've got another question here. Kat Shaw is asking for tab index. Is there a default?
Yeah, the default tab index is 0, and it basically means that when you hit the tab key, things are going to come in semantic order in your HTML. So you hit tab, it's going to be in order of the code when the user hits the tab key. A tab index of -1 takes it and makes it not focusable via tab key. And there is a way to change the default order by setting the tab index to a positive number and doing it in numerical order, but that's not recommended because all of a sudden you are pulling the focus order out into a different order from what's readable. So we should pretty much either have tab index 0. In most cases, that's what we should have, or a -1 for these complex controls where we want people to be able to skip over them with the tab key and use an arrow navigation instead.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that makes sense. All right. And then Kat Shaw also asked, can you explain the connection between the keyboard and screen reader accessibility?
Yeah. So we do. So we definitely want the keyboard navigation to be accessible because obviously, if you can't use a mouse, if you can't see it, but also when something has focus via keyboard, then that's going to also, when you set focus, that will be what's read.
Excellent. All right. Any other questions? All right. There we go. Excellent. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, excellent job, Nikki. Thank you very much. Coming up in October, we've got another great presentation, an introduction to disability studies with Jen, who's a senior accessibility specialist at Thomson Reuters. Please mark your calendars for October 30th at noon time. That's Eastern time. Looking forward to that one for sure. And also, I don't want to forget to mention, we're always looking for speakers and new voices in the accessibility community. We make a conscious effort to include marginalized groups in tech and add them to our speaker lineup. If you're at all interested, please reach out to us at team@A11yTalks.com. That's A11yTalks.com. And for those with IAAP certifications, Alley Talk speakers and attendees receive professional development credits, CAECs, through IAAP for your continuing education. As always, we'd love your input. Please let us know if you have any ideas on how to make Alley Talks more friendly to all. All right. And then, again, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you don't want to miss any of our talks for sure. You can see that at https://www.youtube.com/c/accessibility talks, and consider contributing to Alley Talks through our Open Collective page. You can reach that at https://opencollective.com/Alley Talks. You can follow us on X at https:// twitter.com. I think it's x.com now, but slash A11y talks. Follow us on Mastodon. And thank you for attending. And we'll see you next time.